It is Friday, September 9th. Let's talk PlayStation. Hello everyone, welcome back. We've got another update in this long-running, wild storyline of Sony versus Microsoft and the Activision Blizzard acquisition, so we've got that. We've also got a preliminary look at that new PS5 model, so we'll talk about all that later. But first, as always, our smaller stories and our PlayStation Plus reminder. So the September PS Plus Essential Games are now live. Go check those out. And for our first story, let's talk about the new PS5 system software update, which went live on Wednesday. And the three main headline features in there were 1440p support, game lists in your game library, and also the updated Game Hub page, which bakes in the activity cards right in the Game Hub as a new button next to Play Game. And there's about 20 plus changes, features, improvements in there. As always, we normally do a video showcasing every single feature and explaining what's in there and also things Sony did not talk about, so that upload was also on Wednesday. You can check that out. But one thing I did not show in that video, and I put this in the comments down below, but it was an update to the PS mobile app, which is coming later this month. It's going to include things like being able to start a remote play session right from the app in the Game Hub, so to redirect you to the remote play app, and also if your PS5 is in rest mode, of course, it will boot up and you can start a session that way. And also you can request a share screen right from the app and watch it in the app as well. So that update should go live later this month for both iOS and Android. Moving on to our next news story, Sony has finally announced a new color option for the DualSense, the PS5 console covers, and also the 3D Pulse wireless headset and its gray camouflage, which I don't really care too much for camouflage in any way, whether it's clothing or electronics or whatever else. Not really huge into that, but if you are into it yourself, then the pre-orders go live on September 15th for the controller and the console covers on PlayStation Direct, and the release date for those is October 14th. But if you want the headset, you'll have to wait until December, which kind of implies we might not see another color option get announced until sometime next year. Maybe I'm wrong, but based on that and also the DualSense Edge not getting released this year, or at least it seems like it's not going to be released this year. Maybe I'm wrong about that too, but it seems like we might be waiting a bit until we have another color option after this one. Moving on to God of War Ragnarök. At this point, we should have all the footage that Game Informer said they had, which was only like 4 minutes, so not a whole lot, but we should have most of it now, which we'll talk about what we saw and all the new details. Of course, it's confirmed again that we will be exploring all 9 realms. It is Ragnarok after all, but this gameplay shows us Svartalheim and some of the new environmental puzzles to overcome. So, as an example, Kratos can freeze geysers using the Leviathan Axe, or destroy giant pots using the Blades of Chaos. Traversing the lands, you can expect to row around in rivers, that much was obvious, but it does seem there's a tease indicating new ways to travel as well. Game Informer also touched on the accessibility features. Ragnarok will have over 60 accessibility features, one of which they showed was swiping up on the touchpad to have Kratos automatically face the direction of the next objective, which sounds like something anybody can really make liberal use of in what is kind of an open environment where you're not 100% sure where you're planning on going next, but there should be a lot of accessibility in the game, which is always welcomed. We're also seeing another marketing tie-in, again with Rick and Morty, and I say another because we had one for Death Stranding and also just PS5 as a console before it came out, and now we've got one for God of War as well, which, even if you don't like Rick and Morty, at least this is pretty funny, and Rick does tease unannounced upgrades for God of War, which, hint, hint, wink, wink, not really a surprise. There's going to be some cool stuff in God of War, but yeah, Sony's finally doing some more marketing for the game, which it's only going to intensify as we get closer to launch, and that's why, next month we should have a dedicated state of play for this game. If, past releases are anything to go by, Sony likes to do a dedicated state of play for a game about 1 month prior to launch, so we're really only 3 to 4 weeks away from seeing more God of War, even if we don't have, say, a major PlayStation showcase. But anyway, moving on to our next news story, we've got a major PS VR2 game announcement. It's Firewall Ultra for PS VR2, the sequel to Firewall Zero Hour from First Contact Entertainment, which this is not surprising at all because I think even just a week ago they were teasing this. and they've been teasing this more or less, that there is more on the way for this property and that they were working on PSVR2. They weren't really being sly or coy about this at all, so good to see it's finally out there. And on the PS blog, they did talk about this game, so it's set 5 years after the original. All the character models have been completely remade. Maps have seen a complete overhaul. There's new locations and new contractors, and this time around they'll be using dedicated servers. Matches will be a best of 3 now versus a single set. And also there's a new PvE experience as well, which that certainly has piqued my interest. Not much of a multiplayer person, but PvE, I'm down. And then towards the end of the trailer and the blog post, they outlined that they're utilizing PSVR2 to the full extent. So we're talking finger touch detection, adaptive triggers, haptic feedback, eye tracking, foveated rendering, the whole 9 yards. So that's great to see. Another major PSVR2 title is out there. Still following the formula of drip feeding PSVR2 news. So not sure if that's an indication of no PlayStation showcase, or maybe there's a lot to show and that's why we're seeing it now. No clue, but it does follow that formula. In other PSVR2 news, though, we do finally have store listings live for some of these games. So for Firewall and Horizon, they now have proper PlayStation Store listings where you can wishlist them. You can't pre-order, but at least you can wishlist them, so we're one step closer to the launch of PSVR2. Moving on to Deviation Games, the newly formed studio working on a AAA PS5 project that Sony has signed on. They recently had a slight shakeup at their company where they put this out on Twitter. They say, and I quote here, "Deviation Games is announcing that Jason Blundell has left the studio. We appreciate the contributions Jason has made, and we wish him the best in his future endeavors. Deviation will continue to be led by CEO Dave Anthony, who also assumed the role of game director this past year, and remains a guiding force as we look ahead." So that's the latest update, and it's really too early to say if it's good or bad. I mean, it kind of looks bad when you look at it as one of the co-founders leaving so early, but that's the thing. The studio is so new that what could really go wrong if something did, say, go south? If anything, the website recently updated. They've been hiring and expanding like crazy. They opened up another studio, so this might be business as usual. We know Herman just did a site visit. I'm not sure what we can really say about this right now. This is another game where it's going to be a while until we see what it is, so not sure exactly if this is going to have a big or any impact at all for that matter. Next up, it's time for everybody's favorite rumor, the possible return of Silent Hill as a franchise, and also possible PlayStation exclusivity of some kind. Utilize timestamps if you need to, but this past week a series of events played out, so let's talk about it. So initially there were new images that leaked out, and that showed an over-the-shoulder perspective of the Silent Hill 2 protagonist James Sunderland. These images were from @alleged135, mirrored by the Marmalade on Twitter. Over on Reset Era, where a thread was made about these images, Duskalm says, and I quote here, "These are from an internal pitch demo from Bloober Team before they got greenlit." And then Jordan Midler, writing for VGC, corroborates this claim. "It's more of what we heard already, a Silent Hill 2 remake with PlayStation-timed console exclusivity, and there's also this internal slide from Sony that's been going around, but this has not been validated. My gut reaction is it looks fake, but the contents of the slide is what we've been hearing anyway, so a Silent Hill 2 remake, Annapurna short stories, and a Silent Hill 5 announcement that Sony would get to announce on their terms with a PT-style demo. That project is the one allegedly codenamed Sakura, which, by the way, Akira Yamaoka and Masahiro Ito are working on both the remake and this new entry, or it's heavily implied that they are, and it seems like we should be hearing about them soon. The running theory, or at least what Duskalm has been saying, is that the planned announcement was summer 2021, and that kind of lines up with what I forget if it was Masahiro Ito or I think it was Yamaoka that said they were working on something that fans are hoping to see soon, and that planned announcement was summer 2021, which came and went, so it's more of the same, but basically we should be hearing about these at some point, and I really would be shocked if Sony did not have, either the remake or, let's say, Silent Hill 5, whenever they do get announced, that it would be a part of their show, right? Or they would do it on, as I like to say, their terms, because they're involved and securing exclusivity of some kind. Now let's talk about this new PS5 1200 series model, which we brought it up last week that this new console is finally out there, and someone's going to open this thing up and talk about it at some point. And not surprising, I guess it was expected that it would be Austin Evans yet again that would source a console to open it up on video. So we did get to see this thing mostly in a thorough manner. So let's talk about the changes on this PS5. Or at least the most prominent changes, which right off the bat, Austin did a power draw test and sitting idle on Astro's Playroom. The launch PS5 was pulling on average about 218 watts. The 1100 series PS5, the one from last year, 229 watts. And this year's PS5, 201 watts. So actually drawing less power, which is good. During the teardown, though, is where we see the biggest changes. So the inner plastic casing is already redesigned, nothing massive, but definitely it's a little bit different. The M.2 expansion bay now has a layer of metal inside, could possibly pull more heat away from any SSD that's installed. The biggest takeaway, though, is that the motherboard in the 1200 is noticeably smaller, so they've likely rearranged a good amount on this board to get it down by this much. And there's also a heat pipe that now runs along the opposite end of the board that the prior models did not have. The heatsink itself is now the smallest among all three models. And lastly, the CMOS battery is tucked underneath the heatsink before it was kind of out in the open once you took off the plastic casing. What Austin doesn't show, though, so I'm assuming he's got this planned for another upload, is the SoC itself, which might explain why the console is drawing less power. That's my big takeaway here, is that much like that last upload where he claimed the console was worse, this one he says is better, which may be true, but we don't exactly have the why just yet from this video. It's plausible, but we just don't know, and that means we can't say if they've moved over to the rumored 6nm process for PS5, which would be huge, right? Because that would explain the efficiency gains we're seeing here, with not only the board being smaller, but also it drawing less power. And, generally, yes, if you're drawing less power, you are generating less heat, but the most crucial thing here is measuring the die temps directly, and also all the components on the board, right, where you get an overall assessment of the thermals on that particular device. And if we are seeing some improvement there, that means they can reduce cooling where necessary if it's within the specified operating temps. And that also means this thing will be cheaper to make, right? Because just based off size alone, or rather weight, I should say, right? Just based off weight alone, you've got something where when it comes to manufacturing, shipping, fulfillment, you're going to be saving a lot of money there. And this doesn't look good for Sony, where they just increased the price of PS5, but we also don't necessarily know if they're just making up for what is higher costs, elsewhere with the console, right? Of course, Sony over time will be looking to efficiently make this thing as easy and accessibly as possible, especially during a time where there's not only inflated prices, but there's still a lot of pent-up demand. So they might have found a good balancing act here where they can at least offset any sort of increased costs on the console, where, for example, there's a smaller heatsink here, less copper. That might be why, right? That doesn't necessarily mean it's cheaper to make overall, but certainly to a degree we can say they've maybe kept costs reasonable with making the thing lighter. And, well, we also know Sony over time eventually likes offering slimmer consoles anyway. This one is not that, of course. It's still the same basic size and shape. Who knows if the whole COVID and inflated prices thing have messed up that sort of timeline, because we normally expect that slim console by year 3. And that's actually sooner than some might think, right? We're pretty much at year 2, so we might be seeing a PS5 Slim by next year if nothing got in the way. But at least for this particular revision, we can't confidently say it is better, but it does seem to be improved in certain respects. Now let's get into the latest update for the Microsoft acquisition of Activision Blizzard. This anime arc has been wild so far, and now it's really getting crazy. So basically what happened here was that we had the head of Xbox, Phil Spencer, provide a statement to The Verge where he says, and I quote here, "In January, we provided a signed agreement to Sony to guarantee Call of Duty on PlayStation with feature and content parity for at least several more years beyond the current Sony contract, an offer that goes well beyond typical gaming industry agreements. Now, there was still no mention on how many years exactly. We only have a rough idea that Sony's current agreement with Activision extends to around 2024, or 3 more entries in the series, which that includes this year's Call of Duty, and that Microsoft is committed to going beyond that for several more years. And depending on, the interview and what was said, sometimes they kind of imply it's long-term or indefinite. Sometimes I think Phil recently said it's not necessarily forever or something like that, but they never give a clear answer. And then a few days later, the SIE president and CEO Jim Ryan provided this statement to GamesIndustry.biz, where he says, and I quote here, "I hadn't intended to comment on what I understood to be a private business discussion, but I feel the need to set the record straight because Phil Spencer brought this into the public forum. Microsoft has only offered for Call of Duty to remain on PlayStation for 3 years after the current agreement between Activision and Sony ends. After almost 20 years of Call of Duty on PlayStation, their proposal was inadequate on many levels and failed to take account of the impact on our gamers. We want to guarantee PlayStation gamers continue to have the highest quality Call of Duty experience, and Microsoft's proposal undermines this principle." So, for lack of a better way to put this, or certainly a more sterile way to talk about it, Jim Ryan claps back. This is so wild. It's just, the whole thing's crazy, and that's kind of why, last week it's not a shocker at all that a major acquisition like this is going into a phase 2 process for what is, a lot of regulatory bodies investigating this deal and, trying to see if it's going to lead to any sort of anti-competitive situations. That should not be a shocker at all to anybody. It shouldn't. And so that is why that happened. And now we've got another layer to this where, again, we're seeing something so uncharacteristic of, these two individuals where they lead these companies, and they're not really, you have something where Phil's trying to look like the good guy here offering Call of Duty. You have Jim Ryan now obviously not being thrilled with the situation and now going out of his way to provide a statement saying, this was supposed to be in private, but if you want to play this game, I'll tell everybody exactly what you offered, only 3 more years, which if we look at the current Call of Duty lineup after this holiday season, that means PlayStation is set up for at least 5 more, if they're annual, 5 more annual releases, which, if anything, that's kind of a worst case scenario for Sony. Yeah, they get a lot of Call of Duty for 5 years, which some might argue is a lot and way more than what Microsoft has to offer, but from Sony's point of view, that might be very close, if not right on the money, of a brand new console cycle starting, and they don't want to walk into a PlayStation 6 with, everybody fully aware that Call of Duty is no longer going to launch on PlayStation on a brand new PS6, right? So they don't really want that to happen either. I mean, Jim Ryan he's leading PlayStation. He cares about the company's bottom line. I mean, that's the thing that I wish more people I wish more people would understand about the whole thing. I mean, so much of it goes right into the console war stuff. Comes with the territory, obviously, but so much of it is fueled with a little bit of bias in this conversation about, who's right or wrong in the situation. Sony, of course, a market leader. A lot of fans are going to vouch for Sony. Microsoft has always been considered kind of an underdog. They've got a really strong generation going. Xbox fans are really dedicated and they want to see this happen because it's also a huge value proposition for Game Pass, and they often get upset with a lot of the exclusivity that Sony's had over the years, even though Microsoft does the same thing, right? It's a lot of back and forth, and there's never really a clear mindset of these are both companies that want your money. So, of course, Sony's going to, do what they can here. And it seems like, Jim Ryan is frustrated with how this played out. And also we've got, Microsoft really not looking great here either when they've so far made a lot of public statements, even propping up Minecraft as an example of how they intend to keep this franchise multi-platform. And now we kind of see right away that they've only intended to do 3 more years beyond the current agreement, and they have every intention to not only put the game on Game Pass, but also pull it away from PlayStation, which Phil Spencer has not been looking. He comes off as a more likable individual, much more than Jim, obviously, but he does tend to contradict himself a lot, and I can't blame the guy whatsoever. He runs Xbox. He cares about the Xbox business. You can't fault him for that either. He has to do what he has to do. He's had a lot of financial backing from the parent company Microsoft. Of course, he's going to run wild and do what he can to turn Xbox around in a really big, significant way, and acquiring Activision Blizzard is going to get the job done in spades. So we all need to remember and keep in mind they both care about their own bottom line and earning your hard-earned dollar, and that's why Sony is, making a big deal about this. Of course Jim Ryan's upset. The possibility of losing such a massive multi-million selling franchise that generates a ton of cash that also influences consumer choice on what console they buy, he's gonna be upset about it and will do everything he can to keep the game on PlayStation at a minimum, or even better, possibly, get the deal completely blocked if he can put out public statements that complicate matters for Microsoft's approval process. There's no surprises in how this has been playing out. So I'm not really sure what else I can add here. It's so much of, who's right and who's wrong in this situation. Neither of them are right or wrong, because no matter what, by the end of this, somebody's going to come out better at the expense of the other one. It might not happen right away. It might take 5-10 years, but that's how these things go. It's just, this is the biggest one we've seen so far. Moving on to our next story, we have a big but definitely lesser known or less prominent figure at Sony that is finally retiring. That is Masayasu Ito, the current director and vice president of Sony Interactive Entertainment. So they're retiring October 1st. Masayasu Ito he joined Sony back in the 1980s, but he's been with PlayStation for like 20-something years, basically, since the original PS1. So a true PlayStation OG, finally retiring. Definitely a lot of long service at the same company for what is such a crazy amount of time. And taking his place will be Lin Tao. Lin's been with the company since the early PS2 days, but she had a pretty large stint at Sony's mobile division, and she came back recently around 2021, and she'll be taking the place of director and vice president of Sony Interactive Entertainment. So that's what we've got there for the corporate hierarchy. We don't have news surrounding this too often, but every so often there's some big changes, and that was one of them. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it's very easy. You can follow the link down below. Supporting this channel, a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the big stories from this past week, and our Tuesday video was talking about PS5 and Sony. Have they become arrogant with this console, kind of like PS3? So go check out that conversation. And then on Wednesday, we looked at the PS5's new firmware, so all the features outlined in there if you want to get a good recap of what actually is in that firmware. And then coming up, still no showcase. We'll see what happens. Maybe there won't be one. Maybe it's later this month. Who knows? But until then, that is it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.